Hello, my name is Liv, and my presentation is about Simone de Beauvoir. The quote at the bottom right, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," is a very center idea found in a lot of Simone's work. Simone de Beauvoir was born January 9th, 1908 in Paris, France, to Georges Bertrand de Beauvoir and Françoise Brassier, also known as Me. She died on April 14th, 1986, and her full name was Simone Lucie Ernestine Marie Bertrand de Beauvoir. Quite the mouthful. She is best known as being one of the most renowned French existentialist philosophers, a writer, a social theorist, and a feminist activist. Simone's parents were married in 1906. Francois' family offered a significant dowry. However, the couple lost it following World War I. Simone's father, George, was very atheist, but her mother was a devout Catholic and wanted to raise their children in the faith. This would become a great point of tension later between Francois and Simone, when Simone had a crisis of faith at the age of 14 and decided that she no longer believed in God. George loved theater but followed a career in legal work instead. His family came from a privileged aristocratic background, and he had once wanted to become an actor. However, he had to settle for studying law and working as a legal secretary instead. Simone's intellectual curiosity was supported by her father, who gave her edited versions of great works of literature and encouraged her writing. And the picture in the bottom right is one of the de Beauvoir family. Simone had one sister who was born in 1910. Her name was Helene de Beauvoir, and her nickname was Poupette. Early on, Simone began playing school with Helene, with Simone acting as a teacher and Helene as the student. This would foreshadow Simone's later career as a teacher. When George lost the dowry for his daughters following the war, he became very disappointed in their prospects for marriage. However, Simone did not care about that because she never wanted to become a wife or a mother. She wanted to pursue a career in writing and teaching. And this picture in the bottom right is of Simone and her sister Helene. Her education started at a private Catholic girls' school that she attended until she was 17. It was there that she met her best friend, Elizabeth Maybelle, also known as Zaza. Simone passed the baccalaureate exams in mathematics and philosophy in 1925 and went on to study math at the Institut Catholique. She studied literature and languages at the Institut Sainte Marie in 1926, and in 1927 began studying philosophy at the Sorbonne. This is the historic University of Paris. In 1929, she took second in the philosophy aggregation exam. This is a highly competitive exam, and she barely lost. She took second to Jean-Paul Sartre. She became the youngest student to pass the aggregation exam at 21 and went on to become the youngest philosophy teacher in France. Unlike de Beauvoir, Sartre had attended the best prep classes for the exam and was an official student at the university. Beauvoir was not an official student, but had attended lectures and sat for the exam. I couldn't find it anywhere, but I think that this might be because she was not allowed into those high classes because she was a woman in a time when women were not wanted in classrooms. Her personal life. She began pursuing the life of an intellectual with no intent to marry. However, after her success on the aggregation exam, Jean-Paul Sartre requested to meet Simone. He was part of an elitist intellectual friend group at the university that Simone had often longed to be a part of. Simone was drawn to Sartre because she recognized an intellect worthy and, as she asserted, in some ways superior to her own. And this picture in the bottom right is of Jean-Paul and Simone at a fair in the Porte d'Orléans in June 1929 in Paris, France. And this is the earliest known photo of the two together. Simone and Jean-Paul became lovers, although never getting married, despite Sartre's proposal in 1931, having kids, or living together. They remained non-exclusive intellectual and romantic partners until Sartre's death in 1980. This was an extremely progressive relationship for the time, and it tarnished Simone's reputation way more unfairly than it tarnished Jean-Paul's, because women were expected to hold higher morals than men. The death of her best friend Zaza when they were young had a great impact on how Simone viewed marriage, therefore affecting her decision not to marry Jean-Paul, which I'll get into more later. And adding to Simone's progressive relationships for the time, Simone was also known to have sexual relationships with both men and women of high nobility and esteem. In her professional life, Simone became a teacher. In 1940, the Nazis occupied Paris, and in 1941, the Nazi government dismissed Simone from her teaching position. She was, however, able to go back to being a teacher, but in 1943 was released again after a parent complained that Simone had corrupted her daughter. Simone never returned to teaching after this. She did, however, begin writing. Her first success as a writer was a book called She Came to Stay, which was published in 1943. It's a fictional story about the love triangle between herself, Sartre, and one of her students. Simone reached a level of fame that most philosophers never see during their lives. This resulted from her work as well as her relationships with Sartre and other notable public figures at the time, making headlines and causing a stir. Simone was often considered only to be a disciple of Sartre's philosophy, contrary to the fact that many of their beliefs opposed each other. This is partly because of her own remarks that she made during her life, never taking credit for her own work as a philosopher and her own beliefs. In her later years, Beauvoir and Sartre both began retreating to the solitude of their own homes and mainly spending time with their group of friends, also intellectuals, affectionately named the family. She continued writing, mainly about her adventures in traveling, works of fiction, philosophical essays, and doing interviews. She wrote a 4-volume autobiography, and she wrote another work of critique similar to The Second Sex, talking about the oppression of elderly members of society instead of talking about the oppression of women in society. Sadly, Sartre died in 1980, and Simone wrote a farewell book to him. Some of the things she is most known for, some of her works that she is most known for, is the novel The Blood of Others, which was released in 1943. It is known as one of the most influential existentialist novels of the French Resistance. And although Simone was not deeply involved in the resistance, her work, along with Jean-Paul Sartre and others, helped form the politically unaffiliated leftist journalist Les Temps Modernes in 1945. Simone also worked writing and editing for this journal for a couple years. And the picture in the top right is a quote from the novel The Blood of Others, and it says, "It's easy to pay with the blood of others." Her novel The Second Sex was published in 1949. It is a 2-volume investigation of the oppression of women. It is heralded as a feminist revolution and remains to this day a central text in the investigation of women's oppression and liberation. It is considered her most well-known but controversial work. It was embraced, and still is, by feminists and intellectuals. However, it was heavily attacked by both the right and the left sides of the political spectrum in France and other places in Europe and eventually the United States. This novel was the first time that she considered herself a feminist, and she remained a feminist figure for the rest of her life. She began participating in protests, signing petitions, advocating for women's rights, and continuing to write and lecture on women's issues. Another novel that she is known for is The Ethics of Ambiguity. It condemns the spirit of seriousness in which people too readily identify with certain abstractions at the expense of individual freedom and responsibility. And the picture in the top right is a quote from her novel, The Ethics of Ambiguity. Today, however, we are having a hard time living because we are so bent on outwitting death. Simone also wrote many essays on ethics, such as The Ethics of Ambiguity, from different perspectives. I find this ironic because of her Marxist beliefs. Her reading of Marx and the political ideals represented by the USSR influenced her views, and therefore her writings and political commitments, coloring them both with communist undertones. Some of her biggest influences were her mother's devout Catholicism. Simone was said to be a deeply religious child until the age of 14, and then she remained an atheist for the rest of her life. Her rejection of religion was followed by her decision to pursue and teach philosophy. Her father's rigid atheism, right-wing beliefs, and encouragement of her education also had an influence on her. Her father's atheism most likely had an effect on Simone's crisis of faith she had at the age of 14, and his right-wing beliefs conflicted with his love and involvement in theater, especially at the time, because the theater business was thought to be very progressive and the right-wing political party was not. So that probably had some effect on how Simone viewed her own beliefs and was able to change her beliefs as her life went on. The death of her best friend Zaza also had a profound impact on Simone. The doctors claimed that Zaza died of meningitis. However, de Beauvoir believed it was from a broken heart and that struggled with her family over an arranged marriage. Simone often spoke of the impact Zaza's friendship and death had on her life. This had an effect on her views of society's attitudes towards women and her own views on marriage. This likely had an effect on her decision to say no to marrying Sartre when they were younger. The Nazi occupation of France also had an influence on Simone. Because of World War II and the Nazis' effect on Europe and her own life, Simone began exploring the effect of a political and social climate during one's life on their beliefs. Jean Paul also was a huge impact and influence on Simone, and she was a huge influence on him. Jean Paul read her work in manuscript form before being sent to the print, and she also wrote about him in many of her works. He also wrote about her, although more indirectly, and she read many of his manuscripts before they were sent to print also. Her writings on the questions of ethical responsibility, written from an existentialist framework, later influenced Sartre's work on the same topic. Karl Marx and the political ideal represented by the USSR also influenced Simone in her work and her beliefs. Her Marxist beliefs were subtly weaved throughout many of her works. Thank you for listening to my presentation.